Alright, you know the drill is what I would usually say, but this being the last of these monthly review videos and all, I thought instead of just talking about what games I played in November or December, we would sort of do a recap of all the games I haven't talked about yet that I have played but didn't get to fit into one of these videos. So that does include November and December, but it also includes some stuff I played earlier in this year that didn't quite make its way into one of these. So, without further ado, let us begin with the main feature. Please note that this is not only a review of Animal Crossing New Horizons' Happy Home Paradise DLC, but also a review of New Horizons as a whole following the 2.0 update. Upon seeing the list of features that the 2.0 update added, I decided that I wanted to re-experience the entire game from the beginning to reassess my opinion on it in the aftermath of the various critical New Horizons think pieces that have been produced since the game released in 2020. As such, I opted to restart my island and treat the whole thing as one complete package. Also note that with this review, I am making an exception to my usual review policy. Typically, I prefer to wait until I am fully done with the game to review it, but as of the time of writing, I would still like to finish building all of the co-ops on Harv's Island, fully expand my house, and get a 5-star island rating before I put the game down. The reason I have chosen to jump the gun somewhat is because I don't feel that my thoughts on the game will shift significantly between now and when I finish these things, and also because I've been playing this game for 2.5 months now and would like to include one more review in this video. Having completed the main campaign of the DLC seems like a solid assessment point to me. Strap in, this is going to be a long one. Often, Animal Crossing New Horizons is criticized for being lackluster in comparison to previous Animal Crossing games, and indeed, I intend to engage in some of that criticism myself later on in this review. But going in, I think it's important to note that in a lot of ways, New Horizons is not interested in being like prior entries in the series. Whereas all mainline Animal Crossing games up to this point have been primarily focused on being simulation games with some minor sandbox elements, New Horizons is very firmly a sandbox game with some minor simulation elements. The presentation may appear similar at first glance, but when the game is viewed through this lens, a number of its design choices, such as the reduced amount of villager dialogue, begin to make a great deal more sense. That being the case, if New Horizons ought to be viewed as a sandbox game rather than a simulation game, how does it hold up? Well, in some regards quite well. Features like the Nook Miles system, though the payout itself tends to be negligible after you clear the initial 5 missions the game rolls for each day, do a good job encouraging the player to engage with all of the game's systems, thus maximizing the possibility for creative output. Additionally, the fact that the Happy Home Paradise DLC essentially serves as an endless sandbox mode that also rewards you with new furniture items and eventually bells, though again we'll get back to that later, really reinforces the idea that New Horizons is a sandbox game first and a simulation game second. However, even as a sandbox rather than simulation game, New Horizons has a handful of notable failings. Returning to the aforementioned issue of reduced villager dialogue, though unique dialogue is understandably not necessarily the priority for a sandbox game, it does still ultimately hurt the game to have less rather than more. The issue is not limited to villager dialogue either. New Horizons lacks a lot of the little details and flourishes that made New Leaf such a fun game to come back to even after doing basically everything. For example, compare Toy Day in New Leaf with Toy Day in New Horizons. In New Leaf, you have to spend all month preparing for Toy Day, slowly procuring pieces of the Santa outfit from the Able Sisters and talking to each of your villagers multiple times to find out what gifts they want. The extended structure of this event encourages the player not only to play the game consistently to make sure they have all the pieces of the Santa outfit, but also to talk to the villagers more, increasing their investment in said villagers and thus encouraging them to continue playing the game further after the event is ended. Meanwhile, Toy Day in New Horizons requires no such preparation, allowing you to dole out random gifts to your villagers immediately after giving Jingle 3 pieces of wrapping paper. Though this does force the player to engage with New Horizons' crafting system, the long-term payoff is ultimately weaker, as the event is essentially an over-and-done-with thing. While New Horizons is not trying to be a simulation game, the simulation elements can help to reinforce the sandbox elements. For a smaller example, I was personally disappointed by the lack of a returning barista minigame from New Leaf after the Roost was added in the 2.0 update of New Horizons. Like with the Toy Day event, that minigame made you more invested in your villagers by making you remember what their preferred coffee order was. None of this is to speak of New Horizons' true greatest failing as a sandbox game, though, which is the abysmal pace at which customizations are drip-fed to you. It takes nearly 3 weeks of consistent playing for an hour or two a day to unlock terraforming, which, besides the ability to place furniture items outside, is the main feature that distinguishes New Horizons from previous entries. When the base game is viewed in isolation, this may seem annoying, but not the end of the world. It's the only really egregious example of such a thing happening on your island, after all. Take a look at the Happy Home Paradise DLC, though, and you'll realize how deep this issue runs. Despite being an endless sandbox mode, Happy Home Paradise bizarrely has something of a linear campaign. This choice made sense in Animal Crossing Happy Home Designer, as that game was a standalone title and thus needed something to drive the player to keep going. But New Horizons has the entire rest of the game to incentivize the player to keep playing, so all the linearity accomplishes in this DLC is holding back several major features until later. Features such as partition walls, expanded floor dimensions, second floors, roommates, and, most crucially, the ability to convert Poké into bells are gated off until the second half of the DLC campaign. There is something to be said for not allowing the player access to every option at the start of the game in order to not overwhelm them, But like with terraforming in the base game, there's absolutely no reason to gatekeep the player for as long as the DLC does. New Horizons is often slighted by fans for the issues I discussed 2 paragraphs ago, but those are only minor issues blown out of proportion by how long it takes to get to the meat of New Horizons. Upon replay, I feel adamant that New Horizons never really had an issue with the lack of content. Sure, the number of features missing from previous games prior to the 2.0 update was disappointing, but I still played the initial release for well over 100 hours, so you could hardly say that there was a lack of things to do. Now, I realize that much of this review has read as negative thus far, but in the grand scheme of things, New Horizons is still a really fun game. Even during the period of the game where you are being drip-fed customization options, new additions to the series like crafting and being able to place furniture outside are massive game changers that manage to keep players invested for the, infuriatingly, long period of time that it takes to unlock the remaining features. Additionally, even after unlocking the option to build a second floor in Happy Home Paradise, I still opted to build one-floor houses most of the time because popping in and out to build something quick was just as fun as meticulously planning out a 2-floor mansion for your animal clients. And of course, once you do have all of the customizations available to you, New Horizons really is sandbox heaven. It's hard to overstate how freeing of a feature terraforming is in terms of being able to literally mold your island to your liking. And as stated above, Happy Home Paradise is a blast that only gets blastier with the addition of new features. I can point out technically baffling design decisions until the cows come home, but it doesn't change the fact that I thoroughly enjoyed my revisit to New Horizons. The 2.0 update without the Happy Home Paradise DLC to accompany it isn't as much of a reinvention as I would have liked, especially when looking at how much the Welcome Amiibo update added to New Leaf, but ultimately, I've taken a rather roundabout path back to the opinion on New Horizons that I held when the game first came out. It is good. The think pieces were wrong, in a word, and for that, I am glad. And now on to a much shorter tangent. What I appreciate the most about Slay the Princess is how responsive the game is to your choices. Even if some paths ultimately do lead to the same chapters, and even if the number of options you as the player are given are relatively limited, that doesn't change how impressive it is that the game will react differently to each and every one of them, whether that be on the micro or macro level. The game gets really creative with some of its routes, and the more oddball choices are rewarded with appropriately oddball outcomes. On a more moment-to-moment basis, the dialogue is consistently witty and the hand-drawn frames are yet another instance of a unique art style in an indie game that really helps the game to stand out and build atmosphere. My main issue with the game is in regards to its ending, though less so because of anything specific and more due to a handful of smaller factors. First off, despite running through all of the different routes you've seen in that playthrough, the ending as a whole is pretty short and, well, ends abruptly. The game as a whole feels like it just falls short of landing on a really strong thematic conclusion. Its overarching narrative of 2 gods and a forbidden love is a unique one, and sounds cool on paper, but not all of the routes are actually about that, so depending on which ones you take, that messaging could potentially come completely out of nowhere. The ending also touches on the duality of life and death and how one can't exist without the other, but doesn't really go further than that. Those were the 2 games I played in November and December, so now on to the games I played earlier this year but didn't get to talk about in a video. If I'm being completely honest with myself, when taken on its own, Trials and Tribulations isn't anything crazy. The overarching narrative between cases 1, 4, and 5 is novel at this point in the series, and I promise I'll get back to it later, but the decently lengthy cases 2 and 3 that make up the entire middle section of the game have little to do with said overarching narrative, in my opinion to the game's detriment. The Stolen Turnabout is often hyped up as one of the series' better filler cases, and I will admit that the return of Adrian Andrews from Farewell My Turnabout, as well as the twist of using a theft to cover up a murder, are both pretty cool, but even on replay I failed to find fan favorite Luke Atme, who most of the praise for this case is based upon, as more than mildly entertaining. Then there's Recipe for Turnabout, which I'm willing to say is an outright bad case. Much like the Stolen Turnabout, Recipe for Turnabout is largely notorious for having one notable witness, but unlike the Stolen Turnabout, Recipe for Turnabout's mystery is frustrating. Often I felt like witness testimony was being arbitrarily considered relevant and irrelevant based on whether or not it supported the line of thinking the game wanted you to follow, rather than consistently being either taken into account or discounted. Recipe for Turnabout was originally intended for inclusion in Justice for All, and I shudder to think how Justice for All, which I personally consider to be a really underrated entry in the series, might be considered today if it included both the case with the problematic love triangle and the case with the problematic LGBTQ+ representation. Why does Trials and Tribulations still get a perfect score then? Well, this brings us back to the overarching narrative I mentioned at the beginning, or more specifically, the final case in that narrative, Bridge to the Turnabout. Bridge to the Turnabout is not only an excellent case in its own right, but masterfully ties up every loose end from the original trilogy and wraps them up in a nice thematic bow. The Fake Clan lore established in Justice for All, the drama surrounding the Hawthorns established in this game, and to a lesser extent even Edgeworth's backstory from the original game are all brought together to make for what might just be one of the greatest finales in gaming. It is for this reason that I cannot bring myself to call Trials and Tribulations anything less than the best entry in the series, despite the fact that there are other games in the series that might have a greater number of quote-unquote good cases. Now for a couple short ones. I can't rate Space Funeral too highly because it's so non-substantial from a gameplay perspective, but it's free and an hour long, so you don't really lose anything by playing it. I love the vibes both in terms of the aesthetic and the soundtrack, and the dialogue uses the same rhythms that Shigesato Itoi does in the Mother series, which is always a plus. I can't tell if Murder Dog 4 is supposed to be a satire or a satire of a satire or just plain dumb on purpose, and I think there's something beautiful about that. And at last, here is the final version of the end-of-year ranking list. You may have noticed that there's one game that I haven't talked about yet this year. In fact, it's the game that's been sitting at the top of my end-year ranking list for quite a while now. I initially considered including it in this video, but decided against it, as I have another video coming down the pipeline to which it will be especially relevant, so you'll have to stay tuned until then. This conveniently segues into the last thing I wanted to talk about for this video, which is my plans for the channel next year. I am glad I tried out this monthly review format, but the returns were not quite what I was hoping for, and ultimately most of the videos I released ended up feeling pretty non-substantial, so instead we're going to do something of a revised strategy for next year. Instead of doing monthly review videos, I'm going to do quarterly review videos. And while for the most part these reviews will be of games since that's the main medium I engage with, if it so happens that another thing comes up that I want to talk about, for example a TV show or a play or something else, I'll include it there too. Think of it as a video version of those media review threads people do on Twitter all the time. The reason I'm opting to include non-game content in the videos next year is because there were a couple of things I saw this year that I really enjoyed and that I wanted to talk about but didn't really feel fit into these monthly review videos. So I think expanding the sort of topics that I can talk about in these videos will allow me to sort of express my creative preferences and inclinations more holistically. Shout out to the 2024 Broadway revival of Cabaret, by the way. Absolute masterpiece. If you end up finding yourself in New York at any point in the near future, I highly recommend you go see it. Back to the original point though, to supplement the fact that there will be fewer monthly review videos, I think I want to try doing more video essay style videos. I did 2 or 3 of them last year, but I think, again, leaving this sort of structured, rigid review format will allow me to talk about more things, because I really do enjoy talking about art, and there's more than one way to do that. It can be done outside of this review format. So, I think that's as good a note as any to end on, and with that, I will see you all next year.